Hello, brethren. Welcome back. It is 1:30 and our labors will resume. Next speaker is Ludwik Wodka. He is our Grand Historia of North Carolina. His presentation is on the evolution of the Masonic ritual of North Carolina. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome to my program on the evolution of the North Carolina Masonic ritual. I'd like to thank Wilkerson College Lodge for inviting me to speak at the 2020 Masonic Symposium, virtual symposium this year. And with that, I'll get right into it. Now, few experiences in our life are like the entered apprentice degree. It's the first time we experience the world of Masonic ritual, and for many of us, we're immediately struck by the somewhat strange and archaic rituals, and for many of us, the experience can be profound as well. Rituals, when properly executed, can connect us with the divine and suggest a deeper world of meaning beyond the habits of the mundane. And even though the language of the ritual suggests that it has been presented or preserved intact for years, it has, in fact, gone through many changes. But what are these changes, and why did it change, and why? Today I'll be giving a brief overview of how the ritual of the Grand Lodge of North Carolina, AF&AM, evolved from its beginnings in the mid-1700s to the present day. But let's begin by defining what it is we mean by the ritual in regards to North Carolina Masonry. While there are many rituals that constitute the greater corpora of our ritual work, which includes things like installations, funerals, cornerstone ceremonies, or even work like the reception of dignitaries, opening and closing. This presentation is only going to focus on the core rituals of the 3 degrees of entered apprentice, fellowcraft, and master mason, along with the lectures associated with them. In the course of its history, there appears to be 2 main things that cause ritual to change and evolve. The first is pragmatics, and these are adjustments that are made to the work to reduce repetition, unnecessary complexity, and the inconveniences to facilitate a more expedient delivery of the work. The second is specificity, and by this I refer to cases where ambiguity in the work leads to confusion or dispute, and resolution comes through clarifying or specifying the matter so that the members better understand the proper way to confer the work. And we will cover several examples of both of these along the way. From some more technical approach, we can also examine how the ritual changes and how the linguistic aspect of this might give us some insight. Within the study of language are the fields of syntax, or the study of how words combine to form grammatic phrases and sentences, and semantics, or the study of meaning, or the meaning of words and phrases, and how they form the meaning of sentences. Other aspects, such as discourse analysis and stylistics, can further help us understand the use of phrasing and word choice in this specific context. But in general, we will observe that early on in the process, the evolution begins at a semantic level on establishing the content of the ritual and making sure that the components and the pieces that constitute the work are all in place and in the right sequence. But later, turning its attention to the syntactic level, focusing on the exact wording and phrasing used in the work. So let's begin.
Hold one second.
I'll get started. The documented history of North Carolina Masonic ritual working begins in the mid-1750s, beginning with St. John's Lodge No. 1, which was formed in 1755. Other lodges began to appear around the same time and shortly after in New Bern, Greenville, Halifax, Warrenton, and elsewhere, mainly near the coast. And here in the slide, you can see the progress of the lodges as they formed in the state. It just stopped. During this early period, until about the year 1800, there was no official or standardized work in North Carolina, but a loosely understood and agreed upon set of practices that formed the ritual for making masons. This, combined with the fact that the lodges chartered came from a number of different sources, some of them from England, Scotland, South Carolina, Virginia, Massachusetts, and this led to a great deal of variation. Between the lodges within the state. During much of this time, British Masonry was divided between the Premier Grand Lodge of England, which began in 1717, and the Ancient Grand Lodge, which started in 1754, who we'll refer to as the Moderns and Ancients, respectively. I'll not get into the history of the schism here, but I will point out some of the differences between the ritual among them. When Joseph Monsford organized the Provincial Grand Lodge in North Carolina, he received his commission and authority to issue charters from the Premier Grand Lodge, or the Moderns. In this capacity, he chartered several lodges and organized other existing lodges into this new entity. Okay. And while it is likely that they embraced the ritual practices of the Moderns, there was probably some cross-pollination with the ritual work of the Ancients as well. And the reality is that by and large, the ritual between the two Grand Lodges was actually pretty close and had more similarities between them than differences. The differences are illustrated here on the slide where for the Ancients, the first section involved the ceremony of initiation, where the candidate is received, obligated, conferred the modes of recognition, and so forth. And the second part is the lecture is explained, or the lecture explains the reasons for the various acts of the initiation. And the third elaborates on some of these events in the degree work, as well as the symbolism of the degree. The modern style of ritual from the Premier Grand Lodge was of a much different arrangement, and it was divided into 3 lectures. But the real work, or the focus of the degree work and ritual and the meetings in general, was not so much on the ceremonial process of initiating, passing, or raising members, but it was really on the feasting, the toasting, the social aspect, and bear a strong resemblance to what we would refer to now as table lodges. Now, the layout of the lodge rooms, going back to the 1760s, was basically the same thing. They were organized around a horseshoe-shaped table, as is shown here in the slide. But the difference between the modern and the ancient setup was in the lower right corner, you'll see the moderns had the junior warden sitting, whereas the ancients had the junior deacon, and the junior warden sitting in the middle of the right-hand side, or what we'd refer to in our lodges as the south. However, particularly in North Carolina and most other American jurisdictions, not every lodge, building, or facility where they held these meetings had sufficient space to set up a table of this size, or and the room to conduct the ceremonial work as specified in the ritual. So some modifications were required. And what you see from contemporary illustrations is they began to move from the horseshoe-shaped table to just a regular table or whatever was available at either the tavern or wherever it was they were meeting, and they had to adjust to what they were doing around a regular table. And instead of having an altar or a pedestal with the Holy Scriptures in the center, often that just ended up being placed in front of the master. And because they couldn't confer the ceremonial work with the giant table in the middle of the room, often that section of the work was moved to a different room where that ceremonial work was held. And it is from that the splitting of the dining from the ceremonial work that has become a central feature in not just the ancient masonry, but in American masonry in general. So here are some illustrations that show this kind of setup from the 18th century. And here you have one of a candidate being led up to one of these tables as such. You see the three candles and the warden's column set up on the table, and the candidate being led to the middle of the west. And here's another one from Europe in the early 1800s, and you see that this is no longer in a dining room, but in a special ceremonial space with a floor cloth laid out upon the floor. But we still have the master with a pedestal in front of him with the Holy Scriptures in front of him, instead of a proper altar as we're accustomed to. And again, you see the candidate kneeling in front of the master. And once again, here's yet another image where it's a separate room where and a small room where the lodge has gathered to confer the degree. And the floor, and again, there's you see as common to all of these that have the ceremonial lodge room. There is a floor cloth in the middle of the floor that has all of the symbolic elements that are alluded to in the degree. On the right hand of the slide is a floor cloth that was brought back by Joseph Montfort from England in the 1770s, and is still on display in Halifax, or Royal White Hart Lodge in Halifax. And it's I've heard that it's actually the oldest extant Masonic floor cloth in the United States that survives. But it gives you a great image of this aspect of the working of the degrees. And at the time, they would, since they were chartered by a modern lodge, this would have been part of that modern ritual. So much of the ritual work that was begun in the 18th century resembles the work that we would see in an expose that was quite popular at the time called Jachin and Boaz. And from anyone who reads it, you'll find that there's a great deal of similarity in the structure of the degree, the sequence of the events that take place in it, and certainly a good amount of the language will seem very familiar to us even today. But we find that the ritual practices as they were conferred from the notes and from contemporary accounts would state that a lot of times lodges would cut corners, would leave out lectures, would leave out charges, would leave out prayers, and would, in the interest of time, try to combine the entered apprentice and fellowcraft degree into the same evening to help move the candidate along towards full membership. But this book actually received fairly decent circulation in North Carolina, and the image shown there of an old copy of the book was actually printed in Wilmington around the year 1800. So we know that not only this book was here in the state and in use, but was actually being printed here. Within the book, it describes that, beginning from the 1760s, there was the chalk and charcoal method of drawing the diagram on the floor that illustrated King Solomon's temple. And in the midst of it, where they set up the three candles, illustrated here by letters G, H, and I in the middle of the diagram, they would also draw in with chalk or whatever on the floor the various symbols that were illustrated on the floor cloth. And part of the ritual at the time was, after this was done, the entered apprentice had to bring out a mop and pail and erase the diagram and the secrets from the floor. But later, because this probably caused a terrible mess in a lot of these buildings, the lodges began using tape and tacks or nails to place these things into place. But again, this probably further damaged the buildings and led to the development of the floor cloths that we had seen earlier. So other key features of this 18th century work is they opened on the entered apprentice degree. They didn't take up the word, and they didn't purge the way that we're used to doing. That was a later development. The degree work was done in some cases where they had sufficient space around a dinner table. Drinking and toasting was a key part of the evening, was regarded as part of the ceremonial work. The lecture was done as a catechism, and as a catechism, it was the master asking the various members sitting at the table, working his way around, asking him the catechism questions for the candidate or the new brother to learn about the craft in that fashion. But the ritual work at that point was fairly rudimentary. The lectures were not very well developed. There was the language was not particularly elaborate at the time, and would seem pretty stripped down compared to the ritual work that we're used to today. And as mentioned before, because the members had received their charters or members moving in from all different areas in the country or from England, you have all these different practices being introduced to the state. So there's a great deal of variation between ritual practice amongst the lodges in North Carolina. And the ritual itself didn't emerge, fully formed as one consistent whole. It gradually accumulated little bits and pieces. Prayers, charges, and so forth were introduced at various points along the way, beginning in the 1730s all the way through the 1760s. Incrementally would pick up things like the geometry lecture was introduced in 1741. The Lion's Paw, 1744, the Grand Hailing Sign, 1760, and so forth. Some of the ritual spaces that I had described earlier in North Carolina, as I mentioned, were in taverns and public houses. But one of the key things that is really consistent anytime you visit any of these places is just how small the lodge rooms were, and it didn't have the setup that we're used to with the two doors, the tiler's door and the preparation room door in the west on either side of the senior warden station. A lot of older lodges, you'll find the doors sometimes in the south, sometimes in the north, and elsewhere about the lodges, the building architecture required. Here's a couple more examples of old buildings that survive that where some of these older lodges were held, beginning with the Chowan County Courthouse. Unanimity Lodge number 7 met in the courthouse in a room on the upstairs in the back, fairly small room, from 1771 to 1946. And Wilmington had if you look at that picture of that building, it was just the 2 windows on the upper floor on the left. That was their lodge room. And in New Bern, it's the 2 windows on the upper right. That's still there, still in use. And Hillsboro, Eagle 19, the lodge room is the back half of the upper floor. And again, it was normal to have a relatively small ceremonial space to conduct the work, and the dining room was a separate room in every instance. So in the 1700s in England, an important development in the ritual was taking place. William Preston, who is a printer and a very enthusiastic Mason, began compiling and revising the lectures across London for the various Masonic degrees. And the result was a book called Illustrations of Masonry. And while this has since served as the source for most of our monitorial material in American lodges, in its original form, the lectures formed a book of 374 pages. Now, each of the lectures would have taken hours to read or recite. So in 1796, a young Mason in the newly formed United States by the name of Thomas Smith Webb, who had just recently moved to Albany, New York, acquired a copy of Preston's book, and he was very impressed with it. He thought it was an amazing leap forward in the education that it could impart to the members. And what he did is he set about creating his own monitor, but he adapted it for the American working, and in doing so, he trimmed it way down to a much smaller volume, and he published it in 1797, titled "The Freemason's Monitor." Since then, it's been popularly referred to as the Webb Monitor. And this is the template from which all subsequent American Masonic monitors were modeled and derived, and in some cases just completely copied outright. One derivation of this appeared in North Carolina, where we set about creating our own Masonic monitor in 1805, called the Ahman Rizan. We'll talk about that in a moment. But in addition to the monitor and the monitorial work that Webb introduced with his book, several years later, he also began introducing the actual ritual work and the secret work of the 3 degrees. He rearranged and rewrote the way that those rituals were to be delivered, largely based on the rituals found in the Jachin and Boaz expose. So but the impact of the rituals that he had modified to go with his monitor, the impact of this was profound, and it has fundamentally reshaped American Masonic ritual into something distinctive, as apart from English or the ritual working of most other jurisdictions. And we refer to it as the Webb work. Now, even though that it was adapted from Jachin and Boaz in large part, and there's a lot of similarities in the structure of the ritual work to what Webb composed, there were a couple of key innovations that he introduced. And one of them, and on a larger scale, was that the work was specifically meant to be conferred in a lodge room versus as part of a table lodge or around the table. It was specifically meant to be in a lodge room. And the other thing is the second section of the Master Mason's degree, the dramatization of the Hiramic legend, was something that I have not found in other versions of the ritual. You'll hear it described, but not enacted the way that we do it. And I think that was an innovation on the part of Webb. I'm going to go back here to the Ahman Rizan. In 1805, the Grand Lodge of North Carolina called for us to begin to standardize our work and to follow the lead being set by Webb in other jurisdictions in the Northeast. And the first step in that direction is they wanted to create their own ritual monitor. It was largely modeled on Webb's monitor. But it was called the Ahman Rizan, which draws its name from the constitutions of the ancient Grand Lodge in England. Some other jurisdictions like Pennsylvania and South Carolina also use that same name for their own book, which is a combination of their code and monitorial work. But for a brief period, North Carolina had this book published. I think only 50 copies of it were printed, and they're very difficult to find nowadays. They did not get very wide circulation and kind of disappeared into history. But it does draw upon a lot of the monitorial work that the Webb monitor had, but it had a great deal of songs and toasts and odes towards the back end of it, and had a number of reprinted a number of orations, like the oration given at Richard Caswell's funeral in the 1790s was included in that. So the role of the lecturer as we know it, or the person who has memorized, supervises, and propagates an accurate rendering of the ritual work, is something that we can trace back to Webb in the United States. Ritual accuracy was a fairly new development as well. It doesn't seem like that the work, attention to accurately recreating the work was something that was given much attention prior to this, but we do see that this is as a way to transmit the work, he had to have it memorized, and in order to keep it uniform, he had to insist upon a certain level of accuracy in retelling it so that it maintained that level of uniformity. However, this itself would evolve tremendously over the next 200 years. So Webb also had a number of pupils who he taught this work to. Among them were folks like Benjamin Gleason, Jeremy Cross, John Snow, and John Barney. He taught them at various points between about 1800 and his death in 1819. During that time, there's some evidence to support that since Webb's monitor, as it went through subsequent editions, began to show various changes in the monitorial work, I think it's reasonable to assume that the actual ritual work that was being conferred was in the process of continuing to evolve as well. So for someone like Gleason, who learned the work in 1802, he probably didn't learn exactly the same thing as Jeremy Cross did in 1810, or that John Barney would have learned in 1817. I think that there would have been some variances between them and the working that they were conferring. So Jeremy Cross was one of those pupils, and immediately upon, or very soon after Webb's death in 1819, he published his own monitor, which was almost a complete reprint of the Webb monitor, but it had some additional things, particularly nicer lithograph illustrations. But he was the guy who introduced to the ritual the image of the beautiful Virgin weeping over a broken column. And that first appeared in 1819. But as some of the sources that followed shortly after that showed, that it was adopted and standardized as part of the work very rapidly afterward. Daniel Parker's Masonic cipher that he published in 1822, which is 3 years later, had that in there. And then Morgan's expose in 1826 also had that in there. So it not only was adopted quickly, but it began to be fairly widespread. And while he was Grand Lecturer of Connecticut in 1818, he encountered another Mason there by the name of James Cushman, and he taught the Webb work to Cushman. So Cushman was appointed a lecturer, and he started off in Connecticut, where he was a Grand Lecturer there in 1819. But he, along with Cross, began traveling across the country teaching the work. And whereas most of Webb's pupils traveled west through New York or Pennsylvania into the Midwest, like Ohio and Michigan and Illinois. Cross and Webb were the first that went south, and they went to Virginia, and it was Cushman who was really one of the first to make it to North Carolina. And he came in 1821, where he was promptly appointed Grand Lecturer by the Grand Lodge of North Carolina. And he was the first one to formally introduce the Webb work to the Grand Lodge. There was another lecturer who appeared in North Carolina a little bit earlier on, David Vinton, but he only visited a couple of lodges elsewhere in the state. I believe Tarboro was one of them, Concord 68, I believe. And he taught the work there and was well received, but it was Cushman who taught it at the Grand Lodge, where his teaching was was recognized and approved of. So we have with this map here that kind of generally shows the path that these lecturers took, whereas in Virginia, Jeremy Cross headed west into Kentucky and also into other various parts in the Midwest. I don't really know exactly what route he took, but it went in that general direction. But the others like Webb, Gleason, and Snow took this northern route through New York into the Midwest. And as a result of that, the ritual that Cross ended up teaching to Cushman began to develop some distinctive characteristics that were different from the ritual that traveled into the Midwest through New York. And you begin to see these differing families of ritual that began to emerge. And North Carolina and Virginia together have a great deal of similarity between the two of them in their working, mainly because it was derived from the same source. The differences, of course, emerged later on as North Carolina began to adopt more changes than over time, began to diverge from the Virginia ritual, but nonetheless, there's a great deal of similarity between the two. Okay, so just as to how the ritual made its way to North Carolina, it began with, from England, it came to Thomas Smith Webb, and then from Webb, it passed to the Cross and Cushman in Connecticut, and from there, it came down to Virginia and North Carolina through Cushman, where we have received it. Now, Cushman, when he was in Virginia, he encountered a brother by the name of Levi Stevenson. And it was to him that he taught the work that he had learned, and it was Stevenson who preserved it. So this is just about the time of the Morgan Affair, when that broke out in 1826, which put to a halt much of the work that was being done in most Masonic lodges, especially in the Northeast. North Carolina did not escape its effects, but they were considerably less severe. The result was that proficiency in the Webb work had largely disappeared, except for in a few isolated areas, and was maintained only by a handful of Masons. And in an effort to reintroduce the work, North Carolina began appointing grand lecturers in the 1830s to teach the work and reintroduce it back into the lodges. And Stevenson, while visiting from Virginia, was appointed at one of these grand lectures to assist with this process in 1835. Details are unclear as to how it worked out, but we must presume that Stevenson demonstrated the best command of the work, for even though he was a Virginia Mason, most of the North Carolina lecturers deferred to him and in matters of ritual. And by 1849, the work as he had taught it was formally adopted as the official work of the Grand Lodge of North Carolina. And from that point onward, it was referred to as the Stevenson work. So from about this time, In 1843, a convention was called, led by the Grand Master of Alabama at the time, in an effort to try to bring a number of the grand jurisdictions together to try to standardize the ritual work across the United States. And what resulted was the Baltimore Convention. Now, the convention did not achieve its stated aims, but some of the resolutions that were agreed upon by most of the grand jurisdictions, including North Carolina, were adopted. And these include things like the introduction of dues cards, the distinction between the due guard and the sign, work being conferred, or business and ritual work being conferred on the Master Mason's degree. They removed references to the Star of Bethlehem when referring to the blazing star. And they reversed what were movable and immovable jewels during the lecture. And also Webb's monitor was also formally adopted as the official monitor for that work. So even though the Baltimore Convention did not succeed in standardizing the work, it didn't stop some folks from attempting it, which leads us to Brother Rob Morris. And Morris was a past Grand Master of Kentucky and is perhaps most famous as for being the founder of the Order of the Eastern Star. However, during his lifetime, he was a figure much more controversial than that, and due to his efforts associated with a project called the Conservators. The idea was to produce a pure form of the Webb work that had managed to clear out all of the errors and variations that had accumulated over time, and to create the proper, pure Webb ritual as Webb would have taught it himself. And he would have compiled that into a cipher book that he titled Mnemonics. So Webb set about soliciting subscribers to his program, and but the thing was, as he began going to the Grand Lodges and showing displaying the work, it met with approval in a lot of places, saying that they liked the work, and a couple of the Grand Lodges agreed to adopt it. But when it came out that this particular working was going to be controlled by the conservators and not by the Grand Lodges themselves, that's when the friction appeared, and some of the Grand Lodges began to change their opinion about Brother Morris and his motives. However, there were a number of subscribers to the Conservators in North Carolina. And in 1860, a Grand Lodge committee was appointed to review the uniformity of the work. This is the North Carolina Grand Lodge. And 3 of the 4 committee members were subscribers to the Conservators. 2 of them were Grand Lecturers. And their task was to determine if changes were needed to the ritual. The committee voted to change the name of the Stevenson work to the Prestonian work, believing that it originally derived from William Preston. And this would later be rescinded by the Grand Lodge in 1868, but certainly raises questions as to whether or not any of the ritual work was changed. However, there were none mentioned. It's not surprising that the conservative movement collapsed within a few years due to just intense pushback from a lot of the Grand Lodges. And but the legacy that has been left behind is Rob Morris was the guy who instilled the idea that there was this pure version of the ritual that Webb received from Preston that he had taught, which was kind of closest to the original source. And this was an idea that was would have been familiar to someone who was familiar with the principles of textual criticism. So scholars of the classics or of Bible studies would have seen old manuscripts and would have compared the various manuscripts to determine by the sequence of variations which was the oldest version and closest to the source or the original source. and thereby trying to sidestep a lot of the errors that had been introduced later. And Morse took that same approach with the Masonic ritual. However, it's based on the assumption that there was a pure Webb ritual. And as I indicated earlier, I think that that assumption is problematic. I think that that work did change somewhat during Webb's lifetime. However, that idea of a pure source Webb ritual was something that has stuck with us for a very long time in the way that American Masons have thought about the history of the work. So when the war between the states halted a great deal of Masonic activity in the southern states, as most of the able-bodied men were in the Army, once again, the ritual proficiency had begun to disappear and had to be reintroduced again. And but other things had changed. And one of them was that when Stevenson came back to the Grand Lodge of North Carolina in 1868, by this point he was an old man in his 70s and had been through a lot living in Northern Virginia during the Civil War, and did not seem to have the same command of the ritual or exhibit the same proficiency. And it was stated that his work was, his exemplification was unsatisfactory. So Grand Master Robert Best in 1868 appointed a committee to work with Stevenson to square away these differences and to put together a form of the ritual with a few improvements under the guidance and approval of Stevenson for the standardization of the work. Now, I suspect some of these improvements probably were introduced via some of the changes recommended from the conservators, but nonetheless, they were introduced, and there were some minor changes that made their way into the working of the North Carolina ritual. But this is really the first time that we see specificity of the ritual being the cause for concern, rather than something as broad as like the landmarks being threatened. We're now talking about how some of the wording wasn't right, or some of the wording had changed. And this is something new for North Carolina, and it marks an important milestone in the development and evolution of our ritual. Because at this point, the wording mattered, the syntax mattered. So once the committee completed their work and they exemplified it in 1869, it was promptly adopted, and a motion was put forward and passed to change the name once again from the Stevenson work to the Best work after Grandmaster Robert Best. The revised ritual did not meet with universal acclaim across the state. A number of Masons who were tired of the lack of uniformity and the confusion between the lecturers now had another version of the lecture that they were forced to learn. Many of them ignored it or refused to accept the changes. The Grand Lecturers began to report at this time that ritual proficiency in most lodges continued to be very poor. Large sections of the work were being omitted. It was very difficult for the Grand Lecturers to make it out to many of the lodges because of the amount of time and travel and expense that was involved. And as a result, proficiency suffered on a large scale across the state. But an unfortunate event took place in 1874 when it was discovered that past Grandmaster Robert Best had actually prepared a cipher book of North Carolina's ritual. It was published in a cipher book that was titled Ecce Oriente and was printed by the Reading Company in New York City in 1874, I believe. Best had a number of copies printed out, and he brought them back to North Carolina with the intent of selling and distributing them to the membership. However, this amounted to a violation of the code and his obligations, and Best was expelled from Masonry. He was readmitted the following year, but he had to agree to destroy the copies that he had of the cipher. Nonetheless, several copies still survive in the Grand Lodge archives and give us the earliest written record of a complete version of the North Carolina ritual known thus far. So in 1875, after the scandal was exposed, the Grand Lodge voted to rescind the innovations and interpolations that Best had introduced. And they were to revert back to the Stevenson work, but they were going to call it this time the ancient work of Masonry, rather than to have someone's name attached to it. Another cipher appeared around this time and dated 1886, which shows some differences from the best work that had been published. And this is probably, since this was supposed to have removed a lot of the changes that Best had introduced, I think that this probably best reflects the, an older version of the ritual, though that's difficult to demonstrate. So who created it and why is unknown, but we do have it and it does exist, and it is a single letter cipher. There are several fascinating aspects about it. First is that it still shows the lecture divided into two parts. Part of our lecture was a question and answer catechism, and the other part was just a narrative description. There was inside the cipher was a bunch of marginalia where somebody went in with a pencil and was marking a bunch of the word, and changing some of the wording. So you're watching on the page how some of the things were continuing to change and continued to be altered as the ritual continued to evolve. The 1886 cipher did not have any red work or floor work described in it. However, the Ecce Oriente cipher of the best work did have this, and indicating that these details were fairly well defined as early as the 1860s. And perhaps with Best setting this stuff down into print, it may have helped facilitate standardizing that portion of our ritual work. In 1892, Charles F. Bonson, of whom we'll hear more of later, was charged with the task of preparing a monitor for the North Carolina lodges. One thing the best work or Ecce Oriente reveals is that many of the abridgments to things like the Fellowcraft lecture and some of the other lectures already existed as shown in the best work and in the 1886 cipher. So as Bonson was preparing this monitor, he was adapting it to what North Carolina was already doing. So when he was trimming down the web monitor, he was having it match what it was that we were actually conferring here in this state. Many of the illustrations, prayers, and songs that he brought into the book come directly from something called the Standard Masonic Monitor, which was published by the McCoy Company in 1891. Of note is the fact that this monitor included the apron lecture. Bonson can be credited for introducing this into our work in 1892. Beginning in the 1890s, reports from the Grand Lectures began indicating a great improvement in the quality and proficiency of the work. They also commented on the widespread use of ciphers. So even though the Ecce Oriente may have been destroyed, there seemed to be still plenty of them out there. So whether or not this was related to the improvement in proficiency in lodges across state is unclear, but very possible. In 1902, the Board of Custodians was formed, and the Board of Custodians at the time, in an effort to resolve some ambiguity and some disputes about the way that the work was conferred, introduced some additional modifications. They brought in things like the floor work in the second section of the Master Mason's degree when we do dividing into parties of three. That was something that they introduced. And also having the three ruffians as three separate characters as opposed to being the three principal officers of the lodge. Also they change, at one point, the way that the Master Mason and Fellow Crafts wore their aprons was reversed in the 1890s for reasons unknown, but in 1905 that had changed back at the direction of the Board of Custodians. So with membership increasing at the beginning of the 20th century, The Grand Lectures reports that not only was proficiency increasing, but the work had now stabilized finally, and that there was an acceptable level of uniformity of ritual working between the lodges. And this was in no small part due to the work of the Board of Custodians and the Grand Lecturers. However, in 1930, the Grand Lodge, because a number of other grand jurisdictions had begun developing and printing their own printed ciphers, they began to poll the membership to see if they would be in support of a printed cipher. And this was rejected by a 2-to-1 margin at the time. And this probably would have put an end to the discussion, but 10 years later, a problem emerged. And a report from the Board of Custodians stated, quote, "A constant criticism of ritual tampering has always been with us." I think us meaning the custodians. And we have this apprehension and suspicion that the Grand Lecturers are not themselves in exact accord, as they should be, as to the wording of the approved work in our jurisdiction. It seems that some changes have been made in the past 2 or 3 years, which have not been approved by the Grand Lodge, and these have given rise to the arguments and concerns among officers and members. This is a question that should be settled definitely and at once, end quote. So in 1942, Grand Master Thomas Harkins issued a resolution for the preparation of a physical standard or code. And this became known as the official standard of the work, or the OSW. And this, along with the vocabulary that decodes the words that appear in the cipher book, along with the Bonson Monitor and the public ceremonies, forms the entirety of the North Carolina ritual work. In 1949, a supplement was added that included the short form of the second section of the Master Mason's degree. In 1966, this supplement was combined into a new edition of the OSW, along with a few other minor changes, like changing special communication to emergent communication, little things like that. And things remained unchanged until 1993, when Grandmaster Brunk appointed a committee to revise the OSW. The purpose for this was that there was a number of lecturers were pointing out some ambiguities that remained in the red work and the floor work in the OSW, and they needed to get that resolved and add a greater clarity and specificity to the wording of it so that the work was conferred properly. And in addition to that, the emergent forms of the entered apprentice and fellowcraft degree openings were also included. And this finalized version of the OSW, the one that we currently use, was published in the early 2000s. So in conclusion, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Masonic ritual as practiced in North Carolina was in almost continuous flux. Pieces were continuously being added to and taken away from it as it continued to evolve. And by the turn of the 20th century and the creation of the Board of Custodians, the ritual had become more or less fixed and has only witnessed only a few minor changes over the last 100 years. And although our ritual has undergone many changes in the last 250 years, much of the form and substance of the work that we do today was shaped by Levi Stevenson and James Cushman when they introduced it in the early 1820s and 1830s. Which gives us, how old the work that we're doing now goes back. And we're continuing to watch it evolve. The fact that we have a virtual symposium and there's virtual communications going on with our lodges now indicates that we're on the cusp of further ritual evolution as we speak. And we are in the process of negotiating what kind of changes we can accept and what kind of things that we can and cannot do in this virtual setting. And it's a wonderful opportunity for someone like myself to observe these changes as they take place in real time and as we watch the ritual adapt to current circumstances and move forward into the future. And with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you again for having me as a speaker as part of this symposium.